Hi, I'm Jeremy Vendetti, and we're here at Steveston, British Columbia, to look at the end of the Fraser River. This is Steveston Harbor on the left, and the main channel of the Fraser on the right. I'm about 10 kilometers upstream of Sand Heads, which sits right at the edge of the tide flats that ring the Fraser Delta. The modern delta was built in the last 10,000 years. At the end of the last glaciation, the alluvial portion of the Fraser River was a fjord. And we know that because the Fraser River sediment package and delta is built on top of marine mud. That was the bed of that fjord. The Fraser Delta is composed of a series of bifurcated channels which terminate in the Strait of Georgia. The river bifurcates at New Westminster, about 35 kilometers upstream of Sand Heads. The river bifurcates again upstream of Steveston. At Steveston, the river is carrying about 70% of the total flow of the Fraser River, having lost the remaining 30% of the flow to other delta distributary channels. The river channel here at Steveston is about 700 meters wide. Depths were naturally 10 to 15 meters, but are about 20 meters now to maintain the deep water shipping channel in the Fraser River. Water levels in the Fraser River are controlled by discharge until the delta. Beyond Mission, British Columbia, there is a tidal effect on water levels that increases towards the ocean. There are 2 high tides and 2 low tides per day that vary in magnitude depending on the relative positions of the moon and sun. The maximum tidal range in the Fraser Delta is on the order of 5 meters. Historically, there were natural levees in the delta that would have contained flood flows less than 10,000 cubic meters per second. Exceptionally high flood flows greater than 12,000 cubic meters per second would have inundated the Fraser Delta for up to a month at a time. River discharge plays a secondary role to tides in setting water levels in the delta. The highest tides, sometimes called king tides, occur for 3 to 5 days per year in the winter months due to the alignment of the sun and moon. These winter high tide water levels are as high as during exceptionally large flood flows in the outer delta channels at places like Diaz Island and Steveston, where water levels are measured. And that is, even though the river levels are very low, the winter high tides are still as high as the exceptionally large floods. The delta is entirely protected by engineered dikes today, which are capable of withstanding the current river discharge and tidal water level regimes. Flooding is still possible in places like Richmond only if a dike fails or if there's an exceptionally large flood flow or winter high tide that coincides with a storm surge. There are 10-kilometer wide tide flats that ring the Fraser Delta, called Sturgeon Bank to the north of the main arm and Roberts Bank to the south of the main arm. The tide flats are gently sloping deposits of mud and sand that overlie sandy channel deposits. They are exposed at low tide, but underwater at high tides. Sand Heads lies at the edge of the tide flats. Historically, the total sediment flux from the river to the delta has been about 17.2 million tons per year. Of that, about 3 million tons per year was sand greater than 180 microns. That sand is the bed material load. Bed material is the sediment that makes up the bed and lower banks of a river, and the bed material load is the flux of that size sediment. It is that 3 million tons per year of bed material load that built the delta and the tide flats. The mud deposits on the tide flats are derived from the Fraser River sediment plume that forms annually during the freshet. The plume is made up of washload sediment, which is sediment that moves through the channels without deposition on the bed. The washload plume comes out of the delta channels and is reworked back onto the tide flats by ocean waves and currents. Beyond Sand Heads, the delta front is more steeply sloping into the Strait of Georgia. The delta was built by channel avulsions. Avulsions are shifting of flow from one channel into another as old channels fill with sediment and the river finds a new, easier path to the ocean. Delta channels have historically migrated across the Fraser Delta, building the base of the tide flats with a channel bed material. The channel is now fixed in place by the Steveston jetty and does not migrate anymore. There was an active migration occurring into Canoe Pass, which would have captured the main arm flow and directed it toward the south. That avulsion was stopped by installing a submerged weir that limits the amount of water exiting the main arm to the south. The tide flats are largely a relic of past avulsions and channel migrations that don't happen anymore because the channel is largely fixed in place. The approximate sediment budget of the Fraser River shows that there is less bed material sand delivered to the delta front than in the past. Historically, there is about 3 million tons per year of channel bed material delivered to the delta front, which built the delta. Dredging the main arm to maintain the deepwater shipping channel has reduced that to about 1.3 million tons per year. There is recent evidence that much of the sand that exits the main arm is directed to the bottom of the Strait of Georgia by powerful submarine flows detected by offshore ocean monitoring equipment. This may be in part because the main arm position is fixed in place, focusing deposition on the delta front, encouraging those large flows. This sediment deficit relative to the historical sediment supply will eventually cause erosion of the delta and the tide flats. The time frame for this is not yet clear, but it needs to be investigated. The sediment deficit is a problem because the tide flats and delta front are ecological hotspots for fish, whales, and birds, among other species. The tide flats also provide natural protection to Richmond and Delta from ocean waves and rising sea level. Their erosion poses a significant natural hazard and environmental problem. The Fraser Delta and tide flat erosion can be stopped by further engineering the channels and the tide flats. But the Fraser Delta is a relatively natural landscape right now compared to many major deltas worldwide with big growing cities on them. If we want to maintain the delta and the tide flats in this relatively natural state, we need to better understand the sediment budget of the Fraser Delta. The budget requires measurements of sediment inputs, outputs, and changes in storage within the delta channel. Unfortunately, that work is not presently being undertaken. However, There are key elements of the data required to build a sediment budget that are being collected, leaving some hope that the sediment budget can be established in the near future.